Okay, it's 10:02 here in the UK and time for us to get started. Thanks very much to everyone for joining. My name is Steve Kenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. And we're delighted to have you with us here for the first session in our Reducing Scope 3 Emissions webinar series. And today we're going to be looking at employee commuting and home working. Before we get stuck into that, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are in webinar mode today on Zoom, and that means that our audience will be muted throughout, but we're really keen to hear from you. We want to have a really interactive session, and there's two ways for you to get involved. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat button, and that's where we want you to put your comments. And we see many of you have found it already, and that's great. It's really great to have you saying hello and sharing your details in the chat. And we're delighted to have your comments there, and also encourage you to keep an eye on the chat stream, because we will also be posting material in there that will help you along and to support some of the discussion that we're having. We're planning to have a fairly significant Q&A session after our presentations, and for that to work effectively with the large audience we have today, we need you to put your questions into the Q&A box. And so you'll see another button at the bottom of your screen. On my screen, it's off to the right, and that's where we need you to put your questions. If you put your questions in the chat, it's not likely that I'm going to be able to post them to our speakers. So really key, if you want your question to be answered, put it in the Q&A. And an added responsibility for everyone, even if you're not posing a question yourself, is to vote for the questions that you want answered. There's a little thumbs up symbol in the Q&A box there beside each of the questions. If there's a question that you're really keen for us to answer, give it a vote. That will move it up to the top and make it much more likely that that's the one that we're gonna look at. So comments in the chat, questions in the Q&A. The session is going to be recorded, so no need to worry about that. And I think we're ready to go, except of course, allow me just to take a last moment to acknowledge our sponsors for the series, Shoesmiths, Owen Mumford, and PA Consulting, all fabulous UN Global Compact Network UK members, and we really appreciate their support with the series today. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And before we get started, some really, I guess, unfortunate additional housekeeping that we feel is absolutely necessary. We just need to remind you yet again of the horrific situation in the Ukraine and neighboring countries, as over 3 million refugees have had to flee for safety and are now suffering in really difficult conditions. We feel at UN Global Compact that business has a very important role to play. So you'll see some links in the chat to some guidance that's been prepared by the UN Global Compact in cooperation with UN OCHA and the Connecting Business Initiative. We've got a blog of our own that highlights some of the great work that a number of companies are doing. So there's some, just some examples there that you might look to for inspiration, and links to the UNHCR campaign. And if you are in a position where your company might be able to donate actual goods, thermal blankets and bed linens, personal hygiene items, that's becoming ever more needed. Supplies near to the refugees are diminishing and depleting rapidly. So people that can step up in that area really have a critical role to play. If you are such a person, do get in touch, and we will in turn connect you to Tom McKenzie at the UNHCR, and we can see what we can do to get some aid flowing. Thanks really very much for your consideration of this message. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is, to promise you, the final housekeeping. Just in the event that some of you are not already participating in the UN Global Compact, we are duty bound to tell you a little bit about our organization. And the Global Compact Network in the UK, we're part of the world's largest responsible business initiative, connecting companies and other organizations in a global movement dedicated to driving sustainable business. The UK network is one of 70 UN Global Compact networks around the world, and our role is to support companies that have made a commitment to join the Global Compact. And that commitment comes from the CEO to the Secretary General of the UN, and it is to operationalize the UN Global Compact's 10 principles, which are drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor standards, environment, and anti-corruption. And these principles provide a really robust framework for what it means to be a responsible business. The second part of the commitment is to report annually on your progress, and thirdly, to support the wider UN development agenda, and that is at the moment best defined by the Sustainable Development Goals. We provide a range of activities here in the UK, and our colleagues around the world do the same. Events like this to help our participating companies and the wider business community to align with our principles and operate more sustainably. Next slide, please. Today, we are going to be joined by three fabulous speakers and experts in the area of Scope 3 emissions. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back a regular contributor with us is Emma Watson. She's the Net Zero Manager at the ScienceBased Targets Initiative. We're also joined today by Alexis Munro from NatWest Bank, where she's the Climate and Environment Manager. And last, Matteo Deidda from the Lloyds Banking Group, where he's a Senior Sustainability Manager. We're a little heavy, but that's their charge in this area where it's a really significant part of their carbon footprint. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Before we start, just a brief overview of Scope 3 emissions, just in case it's probably unnecessary, but just to be sure. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard classifies a company's greenhouse gas emissions into 3 scopes. Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions from your owned or controlled sources. So this would be fuel burnt in company vehicles or fuel burned directly to operate company facilities. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from the generation of purchased energy. So if you are not purchasing 100% renewable, well, that energy you're using, your electricity generated fossil fuels, is creating emissions that you count in your Scope 2. Scope 1 and 2 are obviously things that you have a fair bit of control over, and there's a high expectation that companies are seeking very sharp reductions in these areas. But no one is off the hook on Scope 3. Scope 3 emissions are all indirect emissions not included in Scope 2. And these are emissions that occur in the value chain of the reporting company, both upstream and downstream. And the GHG protocols define, as you see in the diagram, 17 different categories of these Scope 3 emissions. So today our focus is going to be on category 7, which is around employee travel or employee commuting. But we'll be looking at in the rest of the series, transportation, distribution of goods. We'll be looking at the use of goods, use of sold products, upstream emissions, and so on. It's quite a challenging space, and while there's some overlap, in general, each category may well require very different actions on the part of the company to manage those emissions. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this is looking at category 7, employee commuting and home working, which has obviously risen up the agenda quite dramatically over the last couple of years. So category 7 includes emissions from the transportation of employees between their homes and their work sites. Emissions from employee commuting may arise from the use of a car, traveling by public transport, traveling by air, or even other modes of transportation like cycling and even walking. You might also include emissions from teleworking, so employees working from home. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it at that because we're going to hear more from Emma, and I feel I'm running maybe just a little bit long. So we're going to hear from Emma, then we're going to hear from Alexis, sorry, and then we're going to hear from Matteo, and then we're going to open up the Q&A. So don't wait though, please feel free to start putting your questions into the Q&A box now and voting. Thanks very much, and Emma, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. It's exciting to see so many of you on the line from all over the world. So I've just got a quick 5 minutes introduction into Scope 3 target setting from the Science-Based Target with some Science-Based Targets with a specific focus on employee commuting and teleworking. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So just very quickly, I wanted to give an introduction to science-based targets in general, just in case some of you aren't aware of the SBTi. So if we go, so yes, thank you. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative was formed just around the time of the Paris Agreement climate talks. And essentially, what we wanted to understand and help companies do is align their climate emission reduction targets to the Paris Agreement commitments. So we came together with our 4 partner organizations. So I'm employed by CDP, but we work with UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, and WWF to help companies understand and set science-based targets. So we have I think this figure is from last week, but as of last week, we had 2,643 companies that are part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, with around half of those having already set their targets. And if we go on to the next slide, please. So essentially, at a very high level, science-based targets are near-term targets that allow companies to understand how much and how fast they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to be in line with the Paris Agreement commitments to keep global warming well below 2°C, but also aiming for 1.5. Actually, the Science-Based Targets new strategy is that all companies should align with 1.5°C. So we do have companies within the initiative that are aligning to the kind of less ambitious scenarios, but from now on, that is really the focus, is making sure that we're limiting warming as much as possible. So if we go on to the next slide, great, thanks. So just to move on to Scope 3 in a bit more detail. So companies have to set, of course, targets on their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Steve mentioned that there's a big expectation around companies to be setting these targets on Scope 1 and 2. But Scope 3 is a bit of a newer piece of the puzzle. And really when the Science-Based Targets Initiative came around was when companies first started really looking at their Scope 3 emissions and setting targets on them. It is a requirement for companies whose Scope 3 emissions make more than 40% of their total footprint to include those within their target boundary. So you will see sometimes that some really heavy emitters, say companies in the cement or steel sector, they may not be setting Scope 3 emission reduction targets because their footprints are so heavily based on their operations. However, we see that the vast majority of companies are setting Scope 3 targets because typically we see that Scope 3 emissions make up around 80%. So when we're thinking about how much a company needs to include of its Scope 3 emissions within the boundary, they only have to include 67% or 2/3 of their Scope 3 emissions within their targets. So there is a bit of leeway there. we have given that leeway just so that companies can focus more on their material emissions within in the near term, and make sure that they're not kind of chasing tail ends of emissions at the moment. So the timeline for these targets, and we're talking here about near-term science-based targets. I'll go on in a second just to talk about net zero, which is a newer piece of the Science-Based Targets Initiative's work. But the timeline for these targets are 5 to 10 years into the future, and that's from the date that the target is submitted. And then companies need to align the ambition of these targets with a well below 2C scenario. So I mentioned in the last slide that most, or from this year onwards, we are moving as an initiative for all companies to align their scope 1 and 2 with 1.5C. But again, there's a bit more of leeway for scope 3, and those targets only have to align with well below 2C. However, that is the minimum, and we do, of course, encourage companies to go beyond that. Great. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that the net zero standard came out last October. So this is again a new thing for the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So really, these are longer term targets that companies should be setting, as well as the near term targets that are 5 to 10 years. And when we're thinking about scope 3 boundary of those targets, so in the near term, targets have to cover 67% of their emissions, but in the long term, they need to be including 90%. And this is, you know, looking out to kind of 2050 or maybe 2040, but 2050 latest. And it's really important that in the long term, companies are looking at their whole emissions footprint. And if you think about it, if we aren't able to address those emissions by the time we reach 2050, then we've actually kind of failed in addressing climate change. So that is why a really credible net zero claim does need to include the vast majority of scope 3 emissions. However, because in the near term, you only have to include 67% of scope 3, you've got that time to kind of work through the more difficult bits and focus on the most material emissions in the near term. Great. And if we go on to the next slide, please. So one thing you might have noticed in Steve's slide is that teleworking or home working emissions, it says companies may include those. So that means that they're actually optional. And that also means that it doesn't count towards the 67% boundary. So if you wanted to include teleworking emissions or home working emissions within your science-based targets, that would come on top of that 67%. So just so you're aware, that sometimes kind of trips people up. And then I think this is the final, oh, I've got 2 more slides. So this one, I won't go, the next slide, I won't go into too much detail on, but just to give you an idea of some of the targets that companies are setting. So London Stock Exchange set a target to reduce employee commuting emissions 50% by 2030. And then ERM also, they set an employee commuting target to reduce emissions 30% by 2025 from a 2018 base year. So those are the types of targets that companies are setting. And if we go on to the next slide, please, I won't go through this, but this, I think that we'll be distributing the slides later, and this is just some resources that could be useful for your target setting later on. So thank you very much, everyone. And looking forward to hearing the rest of the speakers.
Thanks, Emma. That's very helpful. I'm compelled to ask a follow-up, if I may. Are we finding it? I mean, this making it optional on the telecommuting point feels a little bit like turkeys voting for Christmas. Are we finding many companies are stepping up?
Yeah,
setting targets in that area. Yeah, I
think since COVID, I think more and more companies typically didn't include it before because it would be so tiny, it's not really worth it. We are seeing more and more companies including them because they feel that their employees are having a bigger impact. at home. However, it's one of those things that is really, I'm really interesting to hear the next two speakers, how they're influencing it, because it's very hard to kind of tell employees what to do at home. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I think some people thinking, okay, we really need to include it and think about this, and then others thinking, not sure what to do. So it's definitely increased, but not necessarily all companies are starting to do this.
Thank you. So Alexis and Matteo, be forewarned that we're probably going to circle back on that one. So let's go on now to Alexis.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone, and good morning. It's great to have such a global audience here. My name's Alexis, and I am the Climate and Environment Manager at NatWest, with a focus on reporting our own operations climate impacts. Today, I'll be talking about our work from home and commuting emissions, focusing on calculating, reporting, and reducing. Next slide, please. I thought I'd start off with a quick scene setting on NatWest and our own operations carbon reporting. In February, we released our annual results, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. And this snip is from our climate-related disclosure report. We reported all upstream Scope 3 emissions this year and plan to report all downstream next year to help drive transparency in the market. Our emissions from Scope 1 and Scope 2 are externally audited with reasonable assurance, and Scope 3 with limited assurance due to the differences in maturity. So following on nicely from M&M, with the release of the corporate net zero standard last year, we've increased the ambition of our targets. We are now targeting to halve emissions from our direct own operations by 2025, and that includes our work from home and commuting, as you can see in that top graph. We've also targeted to halve our own operational value chain by 2030, which includes all the upstream in the bottom graph and the downstream to be reported next year to help us achieve net zero by 2050. We reported the emissions from working from home and commuting publicly for the first time at 2020 year end, following changes in the ways of working due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's worth noting for us, work from home and commuting total about 60% of our market-based direct own operations footprint, and it's therefore critical to calculate and report. But how do we do it? Next slide, please. So I'll start with our commuting emissions, and we've worked with EcoAct to help build a tool to calculate these emissions using publicly available data sources. And there's kind of 4 different steps that we've gone through, which I've kind of included on the slide here. So firstly, we need to gather accurate FTE data to calculate FTE per region that we operate in. We also need to gather data on the number of FTEs in office versus working from home each week to be able to understand where that split sits. Next, we look to international statistics. Public transport data is taken from the European Commission on Transport, which breaks transport percentage down for the EU average as well as other countries for bus, rail, tram, and metro. Private transport data is taken from a website which has conducted surveys on commuting times in several countries worldwide, and that's for car, motorbikes, walking, and cycling. The average speed of transport is calculated using data from the Mobility in Cities database. This is split into metropolitan and megacities, with megacities having about 10.5 million plus inhabitants due to the differences of transport and speeds of getting across. National Office for Statistics data provides average distances to offices as well as methods of transport. And then finally, we did an employee survey to check our employee patterns are in line with the statistics and figures gathered from those various data sources used. We can then pull all of that into a tool to be able to calculate emissions using both DEFRA and international emission factors. Next slide, please. So next we have our working from home emissions. In 2020, we worked with EcoAct and Lloyds to create a publicly available white paper to help with other organizations calculate these emissions in the wake of the pandemic. And the calculations are split into 3 different groups. So firstly, we have office equipment. So the energy required to power desks and lighting at home has been calculated using the CivSeed Guide F, which provides average energy consumption figure of about 140 watts. And this is for a laptop or PC, monitor, phone, and printer. Also, we assume 10 watts for lighting throughout the year. We then multiply that electricity consumption by the location-based emission factor to get the carbon emissions as shown in that top brown box. Next, we have heating. So we've used the Ofgem typical domestic consumption value of 12,000 kilowatt hours per annum for domestic gas usage. Ofgem research shows about 77% of that annual gas use in homes is used for heating. And then UK energy suppliers suggest heating is on for about an average of 10 hours a day during the heating season, with the UK heating season being October through to March. Although it's worth noting, we review the average temperatures to confirm this and amend the calculations if temperatures are unusually low, so it's unusually cold, or if it's unusually warm. Areas where we operate over large geographic spreads, such as the USA and India, are reviewed locally for their heating days and consumption, just to increase that accuracy of the calculation. Our employee survey confirmed about a third of our households had at least one other person working from home, and we therefore apply a 66.7% to the heating figure, as you can see in the blue box. And I think I can't stress enough the importance of that shared occupancy piece. So it's the difference between a home being heated for one person or for two or more. And this means we can kind of get our share of those emissions as opposed to accounting for all of them. And finally, cooling. So we calculate cooling for India, our Asia Pacific area, and the USA with regional specific data on percent usage, as that is highly variable. There's two main types of air conditioning units which have slightly different energy requirements. So you have the central system, which is about 3.5 kilowatt hours, whereas the smaller wall or window units use about 1.4 kilowatt hours. We use region-specific splits on these gathered from our local colleagues. And we also tailor that cooling season using average daily temperatures as well to be able to calculate that accurately. Next slide, please. So that's kind of how we calculate them and how we report them. How are we planning on reducing those, and how are we working with our colleagues? So we have a few initiatives in place which are on the screen here to help with reducing emissions from both commuting and also working from home. So for commuting, we have our EV100 commitment through the climate group, and that's to install 15% of our car parking spaces at large offices with EV chargers where it's applicable. And at the end of 2021, we'd installed just under 300 of those chargers. We also have a commitment to transition our fleet to electric. We have a partnership with Octopus to install home chargers for colleagues using trusted partners, removing that barrier of identifying a trusted and skilled installation company, kind of increasing the confidence for colleagues at home. And then for our work from home, through our employee-led network, the Sustainable Futures Network, we've rolled out membership to Geeky Zero. This is an app where you can gain kind of points for sustainable living and make pledges to help improve your sustainability. So you can pledge to cycle to work for a day a week, or you could pledge to drive 5 minutes less a day. And then you can compete within your kind of internal teams to see who can get the highest points and be the most sustainable. This has been quite a good way to engage our colleagues and provide meaningful and tangible ways to increase and improve sustainability at home. And then that can also be translated in the office. Next slide, please. So I'll end on some lessons learned from these calculations. So firstly, it can be hard to know exactly how many people are in an office and exactly how many are working from home. We're lucky in that we have systems which can capture this data, but I'm aware that that is not always the case. So I just wanted to touch on it. And assumptions will need to be made. I think that's the case for a lot of scope 3, but here particularly. So as long as there is some form of data and there is a reason behind using that data or where that data has come from, that can then be meaningful and auditable. And data improvement programs can follow over time, but those upfront assumptions will have to be made. Secondly, just touching on it again, that shared occupancy piece, this information can make such a big impact on emissions, especially during those heating months. And it's the difference between taking into account all emissions from heating and powering a home or your specific portion of those emissions. This can be captured through an employee survey. But again, assumptions will need to be made, but so long as there are data and it's reasonable and there are kind of written explanations and you've got that record, it's fine to use those, and those are auditable. And finally, employee engagement is key. This can help with collecting accurate data on work from home and commuting patterns and help to reduce those emissions which are associated. It's key to get the awareness of the scope of reporting communicated across employees so that they're aware of all the great work that's being done, as well as the opportunities available for our colleagues to be able to help tackle this Scope 3 category. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Alexis. That was fantastic. Really helpful to be so practical. Before handing over to Matteo, just yet another reminder to please put your questions in the Q&A box. Not only is it just not possible for me to keep track of everything scrolling by so quickly through the chat, but if it's in the Q&A box, there's an opportunity for people to vote the question up to the top, improving the chances that we'll answer it. But also it's possible for us to do some written answers in the Q&A box that it's really not so practical to do in the chat. So please, let's keep your fantastic comments flowing in the chat. Keep your Q&A questions in the Q&A just to help us keep this organized. Matteo, over to you.
Thank you, and it's great really to be here. Thanks for having me. It's amazing to see what sustainability community have joined the call today with so many people from all over the world. So thank you for being here. Hopefully, the next couple of slides will give you a good hint of how we have been approaching home working and the commuting related emission here at the Lloyds banking group. So if you can move to the next slide, please. I thought, as a matter of introduction, it was probably helpful to tell you a little bit more about our operational climate pledges that we launched in March last year. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to give you a little bit of an overview, we've got 3 new operational pledges. So the first one is net zero by 2030. So this covers basically our Scope 1 and the Scope 2 emission across our branches, offices, and data center. The second one is about reducing energy, so gas and electricity, again 50% reduction versus 2018-19 by 2030. And the third one, which is particularly interesting for today, is about travel. So we made a pledge to maintain a travel-related carbon emission below 50% of a pre-COVID baseline. And this is a consistent target. So every year we aim to remain below this 50%, and it applies to business travel and commuting. We also have some legacy pledges about water and operational waste, and another one which is an internal ambition about biodiversity. So if we move to the next slide, so how are we doing so far, in particular when we talk about travel and commuting and home working? And I thought that you may find interesting to see how the shape and the size of our operational carbon footprint has changed since 2018-19, and to fast forward into then the last numbers that we published a couple of weeks ago into our annual report. So you can see in 2018 and 19, commuting and business travel as well, they made over 60% of our carbon footprint as expected. And then if we look at last year, business travel has basically disappeared. The commuting is around 20%, and then you've got this extra 20% of home working emission that has sort of appeared at the bottom of the footprint. So hopefully this gives a little bit of an idea of what is the scale of the numbers that we're talking about for an organization like ours. In terms of progress, clearly COVID have helped to a certain extent lots of this target, and in particular, if we look at the travel target, which again is business travel plus commuting, we have reported around 80% decreasing versus the baseline year this year. So I think personally, I would find it very interesting to see how this number evolves this year and probably the next one, as we hopefully adopt a more hybrid way of working with more colleagues commuting and going back to the office. All right, so if we move to the next to the next slide, please. So when we talk about home working, emission and commuting, really, where did we start from our perspective? So the initial step is certainly the measurement, which Alexis has already given quite a good insight. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that on perhaps the angle from a Lloyds banking group. And then after we sort of measuring and reporting, there is very much the action plan. So what do we do about, how do we help colleagues on this journey? And from a perspective, I see this as a multi-layers approach, which touch on engagement, on infrastructure, on digital. And I can't really tell you which one of these happens first, and potentially they all need to happen in parallel, to be honest, because they're all sort of an enabler for the others. So starting with a measurement, if we move to the next slide, please. I won't tell you much more on the home working emission white paper because Alexis has already covered on that, but certainly I will encourage everyone that works in a large organization or medium organization that needs to look at home working emission to have a look at this white paper, because it certainly gives you a good starting point on estimating or measuring and calculating this emission. From a commuting perspective, I've seen some of the question already in the chat, and there are lots of assumptions. Of course, there are, and our approach on calculating commuting related emission is perhaps slightly different to NatWest, and we take data from 3 different sources. So the first one is the colleague survey, which tell us how colleagues commute to work and if they commute to work. The second one is our HR platform, which tells us how far those colleagues are from their office or their branch or the working location. And finally, we have one car data, so access data into all our location, which tell us how often colleagues go into their work location. So by combining these 3 data sets, then we are able to calculate the commuting related carbon emission and also to appreciate variances even months on months. Now, there are colleagues that don't necessarily complete the commuting survey. There are colleagues that perhaps travel to a different office than what is set on the HR platform. So all this data needs to be somehow extrapolated and estimated for that population of the colleagues. So once we've got this baseline, we then start really into the action plan, which if we go to the next slide, please. As I said, it starts or it includes engagement. So I think that for this part of scope 3 emission, engagement is absolutely essential. And from our perspective, we really want colleagues to be driver of change, so not just a passive receiver of information. So one of the way that we have started to engage with colleagues was by developing lots of materials that the colleagues could really play with and really drive this conversation within their own team and their own division. So in here, I've put perhaps an example of 2 activation packs, so one for commuting and one for home working emission. The first one is a challenge that colleagues can sort of use within their team meeting to engage the rest of the team, and the other one is just a discussion that colleagues can sort of use as a predefined material. So very little preparation for colleagues to really take this information and go with that. And there is lots more that we have produced. Still on the engagement side, if we move to the next slide, we've also developed our own carbon calculator, and there are many out there which are already existed. There is one from the WWF that has been around for a long time, but the idea of developing our own calculator was to really tailor it around what is the colleagues offer available to reduce those emissions. So what can colleagues do, and how is Lloyds banking group helping them on that journey? So for example, at the end of the carbon calculator, colleagues can get hints and tips on how access the cycle to work scheme, or a signpost into the ultra low electric vehicle colleague scheme, and so on. Moving to the next slide, and engagement is not all of it. Really, we need to enable colleagues to make those changes. So it's very well to ask colleagues to cycle to work, but then if they don't have a shower, they don't have a safe place to store their bike or their bags, their helmet, then it's a bit hard for them really to make the change. So really, provided that infrastructure is absolutely essential, both for cycling and electric vehicle as well. So that is a continuous investment program for us across offices, branches, and data center. And then moving to the next one. And finally, the digital part of it. So this is an area where I think there is still lots more that we can certainly do. But just to give you an idea, as many of you probably, you have like a SharePoint or a Yammer or whatever other platform that you use to communicate with colleagues. We have really stretched that as much as we could. So the dedicated SharePoint page to signpost colleagues on what is available and all the different other portals and websites that we have within the organization. We have a colleague offer page called Perks at Work, and in here we have created a sustainable living page where colleagues can very quickly identify what discounts and colleague offers are available to, for example, switch to renewable electricity or buy a new efficient appliance. And then finally, external platform. So the first one that comes to mind is perhaps Live Share Mobility Ways that we are hoping to start a pilot soon, and they are true expert on this field, and they have been for some time. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, just to say that then all this information about commuting and these tools, we have sort of wrapped them around one message and one framework for colleagues to refer to, which is the 3 Ps of sustainable travel. And we talk about this every time that we talk about new ways of working, going back to the office, and every time we talk about travel, we refer to these 3 Ps. And the 3 Ps, if you move to the next slide, they stand for purpose, planet, and planned. So we're very much asking colleagues to travel with a reason in mind. So if we go to an office, if we commute to an office, is to meet with a colleague, meet with a customer, really take the most out of the day. Planet in mind, so think about what is the carbon emission implication of that journey. And finally, plan ahead, because we find that last minute travel it doesn't always take advantage of the day. So by planning in advance, you can combine a meeting and really make the day important. And that is wrapped and underpinned by everything that I've mentioned before in terms of infrastructure, digital, and engagement. And then moving to the last slide, I think one challenge for me is that when you move like from scope 1 and scope 2, which is very well measured and documented, and you got that everything is metered and etc. Then when you go into home working, emission, and commuting, then it started to become a lot of uncharted territory between estimating the data, asking colleagues to do something, but then going back and changing those assumptions. And I think that final part of the loop, so improving on those assumptions based on the action, for me is an area still to explore and understand. Okay, and that was me. Thank you for listening, and looking forward for some of your questions now.
Thanks very much, Matteo. Also fantastic. Well, everybody's been very active with the Q&A, and we have I think an impossible task to get through so many questions. Thanks very much, though, for I've seen Emma and Alexis getting a bunch of questions knocked off in writing, which is very much appreciated. Can I just put it back again on our audience? We're not going to get through all of these questions, so your voting is going to be absolutely critical, because I just can't scroll all the way down to the bottom and even review all of these questions. So I am going to be at the mercy of your voting a little bit, and we're going to take the questions from the top. So do please have a scan down the list so that we spend our time focused on what you're most interested in, and we will do our best in our follow-up to answer some of the questions that we don't get to. But let's get started, because right at the top, really in the top 3, 2 out of the top 3, question from Jasper, a question from Madeline relating to base years. And I think that's clearly is a big concern for people that are earlier on the journey of setting a science-based target and wanting to know where they're going to start. Both Alexis and Matteo, you touched on this, but maybe can we start with you, Emma? Is there anything from the SBTi specifically in terms of making this decision?
Yeah, so it kind of depends. What we want companies to do is to select the first year that they have representative and accurate footprint for. So that's a bit tricky for this category, because you have to therefore understand, if it's going to be representative, you have to therefore think that this pattern is going to continue. So if your first year where you had like a really good estimate of the employee commuting emissions was 2017, but so normally that's the base year that you would select. However, because of the pandemic, perhaps you think that actually, 50% of your employees are going to still be working from home probably forever. This is a new way of working. This is the new normal. Then you might actually select 2021. So it kind of just depends on your business. If you're kind of a retailer, for example, that, your employee commuting emissions might not change, and therefore 2017 would be the one to select. But for, banks, that might be different because most employees might be at home. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a bit of a judgment call.
Okay. Alexis, how did you guys make that judgment?
So from our perspective, pre-pandemic, we were in a hybrid working model. So we had people working from home as well as coming into the office. So we have a 2019 baseline, with 2020 being the first year we reported. So we wanted to have 2 years worth of data there. And 2019 is also our baseline for our other targets as well. So that kind of 2025 and 2030 target that we've set ourselves.
Matteo, how about you? You spoke about 2018, I think, as a baseline.
Yeah, 18-19. To be honest, we started working on the new operational climate pledges around 2020. So before COVID started. So from our perspective, the conversation was, all right, we just need to base all our targets on the latest data that we have available and the most accurate data we have available. So that's why we went for 2018-19. And there was also a conversation about how far the target should be, and from 2030, 2035 and 2025, and then after long conversation at different level, 2030 seemed the right and realistic way to go.
Thank you all. The next question that's got a lot of votes from Andy regarding behavior changes, and how do you amend your, I'm going to have to interpret a little bit, but how are you amending, I suppose, your assumptions to take into account changing behaviors? Alexis, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. So thank you, Andy. I think there's two different parts to this. So there's the behavior change and also the kind of the data accuracy piece. So tackling the kind of the latter first. Every year we kind of go through a data accuracy kind of update, and we have programs in place internally to kind of improve that and look at what data do we need to be getting, and we go through that audit process as well. So I think that's a continual shift, and kind of one to kind of plan ahead for and identify. From a behavior change perspective, it's that move from kind of in office to at home and maybe back to the office again that we're starting to see. So I think it's a case of tracking that data and just seeing what's the most reflective. Is it the most reflective to take an annual average of that figure and apply that, or is it a month by month basis? And I think that's really company specific and organization specific to be able to track that and understand what those patterns are, but they will definitely impact the emissions. So it's definitely one to track.
Matteo, how are you guys addressing this?
Yeah, I think that actually I think it's a great question. It goes back to that my last challenge is almost like closing that loop between action and then rechanging the assumption. I think just to make, I think you start from the best you can, really. Probably the best you can is lots of assumptions. And then you just try to make step changes to improve that. So for one example that I can bring is perhaps in our first year of reporting home working emission and commuting, well, actually on home working emission, we sort of asked the colleagues how many times a week you're working from home, basically. So as simple as that, and then we extrapolated the data. But then in year 2, we actually started to look at how many ID card, Lloyds card that we've got swapped into the office, so we could actually know how many entries we had into an office or how many FTEs were into the office. So we sort of improve on that assumption and then fed back. So I think it's just that journey to pick up the assumption and then just try to improve them really as you go along and as you collect the better data. But lots of information are still based on the assumptions. So for example, for home working colleagues, so what is the power of their laptop monitor and home desk? That is assumed from the CIPSI publication still.
And I think it's interesting. To me, it's interesting that obviously in most scope 3 categories, it's really clearly somebody else's scope 1 and scope 2. So it's probably being measured more accurately somewhere. But that's not so much the case with this category, where it's the employees' scope 1 and 2. And so it is really important that we go through those iterations to ensure that the assumptions are as accurate as they can be. Now, I'm thinking we've probably knocked the question from Liz on the head with that, so we're going to take that out. Now, you've spoken about Max's question, how emissions from teleworking are tracked and calculated. Maybe just a really brief summary of what are you including in those teleworking emissions, and how are you getting that data from the employees? Again, maybe we'll start with you, Alexis.
Yeah, so how we're gathering it through those kind of employee surveys, as well as those kind of assumptions outlined in the kind of a home working white paper. So I do recommend people kind of read that. It kind of gives that kind of further detail there. But I think that hybrid approach, it's finding the right level of average to take for that in office and working from home, and tracking that and looking at and maybe asking through a survey what people have on their desks or what technology they're using at home.
Matteo.
Yeah, I don't think it's too dissimilar really from what Alexis said or what I said earlier. So you sort of start with the best that you can, which is probably published data, and I think that's the starting point for a lot of us. And then you're just trying to improve as much as you can. So, for example, I've showed on my presentation that we have like a colleague offer website, and some of the offers out there are right to get into a renewable electricity tariff at home and get a 2% discount or whatever. Then being able, for example, to track how many colleagues have taken that offer then could help you adjusting the assumption of where their electricity comes from at home. So this is how the small incremental improvement on the assumption works.
Okay, I'm just trying to scan down, and the question in third spot now from James: have you explored options to support colleagues in switching their home energy use to renewable? That's probably the biggest component of teleworking emissions. Have you got schemes in place? Maybe this time we'll reverse the order and I'll go to Matteo first. Yeah, so we have offers, and we tell, whenever we talk to colleagues about what action that you can take, and then clearly switching to a renewable supply is always number one because it costs nothing, and the impact is it's huge. So there are offers out there which are available for all colleagues throughout the general colleague offers. And in the past, we've looked as well at the potential of doing some subsidized offers as well on top of what may already be available, but you find that you very quickly hit benefit in kinds regulation and so on, so it becomes a little bit complex to get into that area. But I think it very much goes within the engagement part of the conversation with colleagues. By doing this is the impact you can have. Alexis.
So from our perspective, we don't have any offerings in place. It's a political issue. But we are kind of similarly with Matteo, you know, if colleagues ask how they can help, what's a tangible action they can take, you know, a renewable tariff at home is definitely a big hit. And it's one that we will be trying to include in the next survey is, are you on a green or brown tariff, or do you not know? It's quite a key piece of information and next step for data improvement.
Thank you both. I'm afraid I think we're out of time. We just got too many questions here and too little time. So I'm going to just skip to again the third place question from Mark, and it was originally directed at you, Alexa. Just really, what outstanding challenges do you still find the most difficult? And I think, if I may, I'd like we'll pose that to all three of you as our parting words, if we might. So do you want to start, Alexis?
Yes, I think from my perspective, it's kind of data gathering and data accuracy, I think, is always key. Employee engagement and understanding, and that's a kind of ongoing education piece. And a final for a kind of a top three. I've set myself a challenge there. It would be the kind of what's next, and how we can kind of be proactive in searching for that as a challenge.
Fabulous, thank you. Matteo?
I think, well, as you may expect, Alexis' challenges are also challenges because we work in two very similar organizations. I think I also see this as a huge opportunity, though. I remember like 10 years ago when I started to work in sustainability, there were very few organizations reporting scope 3 emission, and you almost know them by name, and it was almost like going above and beyond. And it feels like home working emission and commuting, it is a little bit on that space now. Is not lots of organizations doing it. There's lots of estimation, a bit of uncharted territory. So I really think that over the next couple of years, this will become the norm and the expectation that organizations are disclosing this. So I think that lots of clever people out there will come up with lots of clever ideas on how the data can be refined and how we can report more accurately and so on.
Thanks, Matteo. That's a great challenge to our audience to step up and match the kind of efforts that you guys are putting into this. Emma, over to you.
Yeah, I think employee commuting and home working is a bit of a strange category, because I think for most companies it ends up being a really small portion of the total footprint. But saying that, I think it's a really important category for employee engagement and making sure that everyone in the company is kind of on board, and that's their biggest impact. However, as Matteo and Alexis kind of alluded to, there are things that are really getting in the way of actually making the biggest emission reductions. At home, it's going to be switching, your energy supplier, but there are regulations and also politics in the way. So it's a tricky one, and I really find these conversations fascinating, and it's one that affects everyone. So good luck to everyone trying to tackle it.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, I think that's one of the most important aspects of this category is the bringing about societal behavior change and the really critical role that employers can play in encouraging and incentivizing individuals to think about their footprint and reduce it. Because of course, it's not going to be just down to companies and governments, but everybody needs to get on board with this transformation. Thank you all very, very much. It's been a fantastic session. I really appreciate your sharing of your expertise so generously. And thanks everyone in the audience for the fantastic questions and really brilliant comments in the chat too. And we'll do our best to synthesize all of that into some key takeaways that we'll be sending around. Next up in this series, on the 29th of March, we'll be looking at emissions from business travel. So similar but different from today. And so we hope you'll be able to join us for that session. Again, if you can scan that QR code, that'll take you to the registration page. If you can't, just visit our UN Global Compact Network UK website, and you can find more information on speakers and links to join. After that, well, not after that, another series that we've got running, also of interest to you climate folk. It's our Climate and Human Rights Building Resilience for Business series, and we'll be looking at just transition on the 20th of April. Next slide. I think we've got a couple more upcoming events to tell you about. Yes, we're starting a Pride Plus Building LGBTIQ Plus Inclusive Business series kicking off on the 29th of March. And this afternoon, in fact, will be the next in our SDG Benchmarks for Business Transformation session, looking at gender balance at all management levels. I think that's the last slide. I'll take the opportunity once again to thank our sponsors, Owen Mumford, Shoesmiths, and PA Consulting for supporting the series. Thanks again to Alexis, Matteo, and Emma, to the team for pulling this together, and for all of you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.